Hey everyone, I wanted to do a short little video today. I saw someone on the internet asking a question about what do you say when somebody, usually a Varibu of some kind, tells you that history is written by the victors, so they reject the conventional historical consensus for what they see as the truth, right? And so I thought I'd address this concept of history being written by the victors, or victors' history as I call it. You might recognize the background frame from my first Varibu video there. See how many victors you can recognize in that picture. And I do apologize, I've got a little bit of a bias towards Eastern Europe, as you can probably see. But anyway, let's address this claim that history is written by the victors. No, it's not. Oh, okay, you're probably expecting me to elaborate on that. I thought that was self-evident, but let's go. All right, so first of all, if you want to see a really good video on how history is not written by the victors, I'm going to recommend this one by Potential History. You can find that link down in the description for this video. I want to focus more on the broad trend of, let's say, losers' history, and try to help explain why sometimes it's the losers that write history and not the victors. That seems very counterintuitive, but it's actually not, and you'll see that there are often very, I will not say good reasons for letting the losers write their own history, and they were usually not morally good by any stretch, but they were logical if you consider the interests of the people who made this happen. Now, if you want to see a really good example of history being distorted in this way, I think it's fun to look at a very popular film which actually in the beginning had a character saying history is written by those who hanged heroes. I'm talking about Braveheart, of course. Americans love Braveheart. It is a wildly historically inaccurate movie on every level, in every way possible. But a funny thing about our society is that pop culture tends to do more to form people's understanding of history than actual history classes or books. So a lot of Americans, at least around the time that movie came out, and perhaps even now, a lot of them think that that is an accurate depiction of history, or that accurately depicts Scottish history. And of course, it glorifies William Wallace and makes him into this great hero when he basically lost, right? I mean, he ended up getting killed. And if anything, Robert the Bruce is really the hero of the Scots in this case. But that movie turns Wallace into the hero. And like I said, in our time, it forms many people's understanding of the Middle Ages and of the conflict between the English and the Scots, which is very bad. I just want to make that clear, okay? But it's funny how that movie has a line in it that refers to Victor's history, and in a way it is a small microcosm of that loser's history. So that's just a very small example. But we could look at the classical world, for example. Sparta. This is Sparta, the greatest warriors trained for war from childhood. All this absolute nonsense. Sparta, if you take any time to actually study anything about Sparta, and I'm going to link to a very good video in the description that'll break everything down to you. Sparta is one of the most ridiculously overrated, I guess you could say, countries. I mean, it's a kingdom, a city-state, whatever you want to call it. But the idea that they were these great warriors who were never defeated in battle, except that one time when they heroically sacrificed themselves against the Persian army. I mean, like, this is all absolute nonsense. I mean, in the Agoge, where they're supposed to study for war, they were studying things like dancing and reciting poetry. And another thing about Sparta, and this is why Sparta, it's funny how popular Sparta is with right-wing movements around the world, because I'm going to keep this family friendly, but let's just say that when it comes to Sparta and the upbringing of boys in Sparta, if Law and Order SVU existed in the classical world, the series finale would probably have something to do with busting Sparta. Like, they would shut down the Agoge. This would be ancient Benson and Stabler's mission to shut them down. Okay, so we'll just leave it at that. Okay, Sparta sucks, all right? But what's the popular memory of Sparta? The great warriors and the bred for war and all this nonsense, right? And the great myth of Thermopylae, where we focus on the 300 Spartans and just totally ignore the Spartan helots, ignore the other Greeks that were there. And it became this great myth of the suicidal stand when it actually was not planned to be suicidal like that. Anyway, just another example, right? Now, the modern examples where you see this happening the most, I think in the West, especially the United States, is of course with the so-called lost cause of the South, that being the Confederacy, and the whole Varibu thing, the clean Wehrmacht myth, all the myths about Germany on the Eastern Front, where we just sort of let people whitewash. I mean, we literally, the U.S. Army let the Germans write their own history of that, okay? Why do these things happen? Why do the losers get to write history? Well, sometimes when one side wins a war, for whatever reason, they suddenly have an interest in rehabilitating the losers, a political interest typically, right? In the United States, after the Civil War, one important goal was to reunite the country and rebuild the South. Now, there were some people in the South who were very opposed to Reconstruction, and they basically terrorized it to the point where they were able to sort of reimpose a form of white supremacy, not quite to the extent of the antebellum South, but they were able to do that. And eventually, we had the imposition of stuff like segregation and Jim Crow and things like this. And ultimately, what you had is that achievement of some kind of national unity or cohesion, but of course at the expense of Black America. Now, when it comes to the Second World War, it's a little bit different because we're talking about two major allies, in this case the United States and the United Kingdom, and they had some common goals, but also they had kind of their own reasons for basically letting the Germans walk all over their history, right? So the obvious reason was the Cold War. Western leaders, U.S. leaders were coming to the understanding that they might have to fight the Soviet Union at some point, and there was this idea that the Germans were the ones who had the most experience fighting the Red Army, so they could provide something of value to Western forces and to the new NATO forces. Then another aspect of it is when you look at, for example, the United Kingdom, you had this situation where they were this great empire, and in the first part of that war, they were basically the first to get involved in the war, along with France, after Germany invaded Poland. And they did not do too well in the first few years of the war. They did better than most people give them credit for, but most people just think of Norway went badly, there was a phony war, and then France and the Low Countries, absolute disaster. And then North Africa, you had some big reversals and stuff like that until finally you get El Alamein. But there's a lot of blame to go around, and what that kind of led to was a situation where people wanted some kind of explanation for this. And you had this guy, this military theorist and historian, Sir Basil Littlehart, and he's a bit of a controversial figure. He basically helped publish the memoirs of Heinz Guderian, who is often wrongly credited with being the architect of Germany's Panzer forces. He's credited with that because he basically got his memoirs published that said he was the architect of them and left out all these other people. But there is an allegation that Littlehart sort of massaged history a little bit to make it seem like his interwar works had a big influence on German doctrine, especially armored doctrine. Just to be clear, this is something that is debated. I'm just saying it's out there. But if we accept that Littlehart did sort of insert himself into the development of German armor doctrine, you can see there's a personal motive for that. Because in that way, it's like saying, look, you didn't listen to me, but this German guy listened to my ideas, and he inflicted this humiliating defeat on us early in the war. So that's a personal motive. And there's further reason to build up this myth of this great, powerful German war machine, because the fact is that in the early Second World War, in some cases for totally understandable reasons, but in other cases not, the British and French forces made huge mistakes. And you really could argue that early 1940 blitzkrieg that conquered France, it was largely due to massive mistakes, tragic mistakes on the part of the Anglo-French forces. And looking back at that, obviously, that's not very politically convenient. So why not play up the idea that the Germans were using these superior tactics and even had superior weapons, even though this wasn't the case? And of course, pop culture ran with all this because in our movies and our video games and things like that, we want to imagine a stronger enemy. It's not really interesting to have antagonists who are strong but just can't really win the war because strategically they don't have the resources or the manpower to do it. And that's the case of Germany. What they did was they were mobilizing and planning for a war earlier than the people they were going to fight. They got some practical experience earlier before the war even started, and they built up a force that could cause huge problems, but just could not sustain the war that they ended up fighting. But that doesn't make for a good movie. It doesn't make for good reading either, right? But that's just the way it is. And when speaking of the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union has itself to blame as well in this case. Because all that time while the Germans were publishing their memoirs in the West, the Soviet Union was pretty tight-lipped about the history of the war. What they put out was usually full of propaganda. A lot of their memoirs were not translated and widely distributed in the West. Of course, infamously, the Soviet Union didn't even agree on when they got involved in the war. And that narrative is making a bit of a comeback today. But the point is, what you had German commanders writing their history of the Eastern Front basically unopposed, and the Soviets have no one but themselves to blame for that. So the point here is that we shouldn't see history as written by the victors, especially now because we live in an information age when anybody can post anything online, and many countries have their own little soft power organs. What I mean is like YouTube channels, social media, TikTok and stuff like that. And we kind of live in a world where everybody just gets to believe whatever they want. It's like part of your personal identity. And I hate this, but that's the way it is, right? And in that case, losers can write their own history, and if people want to believe that, then they do, right? So are there examples of history being written by the victors? Sure, that does happen. And real history seeks to test those cases, see if we can find other evidence that refutes those claims. And sometimes we do reevaluate, for example, the effects of a certain battle on how it influenced the war or something like that. But I would say there's really no rule about this, and especially in our era, no. Basically, anybody can write whatever they want, and it oftentimes, unfortunately, comes down to who has the loudest voice, who has the most pervasive social media campaign, satellite channels, whatever. All right, so that's it. I'd like to direct you to the description below where you can find those links I talked about earlier. And also there's a link to my Patreon site. Please consider becoming a patron. If you join at the $5 level, I've got these sort of like audio logs I release from time to time where I talk about pretty much anything. Also, I'd like to thank all those who donated to my little fundraiser to get medical equipment for the frontline medics in Ukraine. I've already got a pretty good haul, and I hope to get a little more before I go there in November. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.